Some signals don't shout, they whisper through stillness. Harrison Ford hadn't meant to stop in that town. It was just a gas station, just a small-town parade. But then he saw a little girl in the crowd, silent, unmoving, raise her hand in a way only someone like him would understand. One gesture, one glance, and everything changed. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe. He wasn't supposed to be there, just a fuel stop. 10 minutes, maybe 15. That was the plan. Harrison Ford had pulled his old pickup to the edge of Main Street in a quiet Montana town he didn't even know the name of. The kind of place where time moved slow and people still waved at strangers. He leaned against the truck, worn leather jacket creaking as he crossed his arms, watching the summer parade pass like someone flipping through channels he wasn't really interested in. Kids screamed with laughter. A marching band stumbled through a patriotic tune. Cotton candy spun in tight blue clouds. Flags flapped from every porch. And then she appeared, not like the rest. Not running, not laughing, not even blinking. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, stood just beyond the sidewalk barrier. Long sleeves down to her wrists despite the heat, her face too still, her body too quiet. Around her the world danced. She didn't wave. Didn't smile, she just stood. Then came the signal. It was almost nothing. Her small hand curled into a fist, opened slowly, then pressed flat against her chest. Once, quiet, deliberate. In the noise of a parade, it should have meant nothing. To most people, it didn't. But Harrison Ford stopped mid-step, one foot hovering, half-turned. He didn't even realize he'd been walking away until his boots froze against the asphalt. He blinked. Once, twice. The brim of his hat dipped as he tilted his head just enough to catch the girl again. That motion, it wasn't random. It wasn't nervousness or childlike mimicry. It was practiced, taught. A signal. 20 feet away, the girl didn't move again. She didn't follow it up, didn't try to draw attention. If anything, she looked smaller now, disappearing into the sea of red, white, and blue. But Ford's eyes didn't leave her. Behind him, a man selling lemonade shouted over the music. A woman pushed a stroller past, with twin toddlers swatting at bubbles. Laughter, brass instruments, the occasional bark of a parade dog echoed down the avenue. But Ford was somewhere else now, or maybe sometime else. Somewhere between this street and all the others he'd stood on where children didn't scream for help, because they couldn't. He exhaled through his nose, subtle, measured. His left hand slid into his jacket pocket and closed gently around a keyring. Not keys, not a weapon, just a flattened compass, the kind given to downed pilots as a last resort. He hadn't looked at it in years. He watched her posture, straight, still, controlled. A child too young to be that quiet. The man beside her, well-dressed, smiling, relaxed, rested one hand on her shoulder in a way that said protection to everyone else. But Harrison Ford had seen that hand before. Not that one exactly, but the type. The pressure behind the pose. He didn't move, not yet. This wasn't a movie. It wasn't time for a line or a leap. It was time to listen, to notice what others didn't. He watched. The crowd kept celebrating. The girl kept standing. And inside him, something old stirred. Not adrenaline, not fear, just memory. Memory that knew what signals looked like when no one else could see them. He glanced down the road, saw the parade stretching toward the horizon. Thought briefly about climbing back into the truck and driving away. He'd done his time, fought his battles, saved who he could, but the girl hadn't looked at anyone else, and she had raised her hand, so he stayed, still, silent, watching. And the engine inside him, the one that had cooled over decades, began to hum again. He didn't move toward her, not directly. Harrison Ford knew better than that. In places like this, in moments like this, you didn't charge forward, you circled. You watched, you waited for the things that didn't want to be seen. He shifted his weight and eased into the shadows of a storefront, blending into the architecture like weathered brick. To most, he was just another older man dodging the sun. But his eyes never left her. Not through the glass, not through the chrome of a parked motorcycle, not through the bakery window where pies sat behind fogged display cases and a small child pressed their face to the glass. Reflections told more truth than people. The little girl still hadn't moved. Her arms were stiff at her sides, her sleeves too long for the sweltering heat. Her face didn't register discomfort, only calculation. She wasn't confused. She wasn't distracted. She was measuring. The man beside her bent down, said something into her ear, and smiled like this was a perfect summer day. He wore a crisp linen shirt, sunglasses tucked into the collar. His left hand rested lightly on the back of her neck. From a distance, it looked like care. In the reflection of a car window, it looked like control. And then came the flicker. As the man adjusted the girl's collar, just slightly, casually, her sleeve lifted, and sunlight touched the inside of her forearm. Ford's eyes narrowed. The skin was marked. Not with fresh red or swollen purple, but a faded yellow, bruising that had lingered too long. The shape wasn't random. 4 fingers wrapping like a bracelet too tight. She tugged her sleeve down fast. Reflex. Like someone who'd been taught what not to show, Ford exhaled, quiet, heavy. His hand remained in his pocket, thumb circling the rim of that old compass. He hadn't thought of her in years. The other girl, Idaho, 1999. A storm had grounded the local medevac chopper. He'd been flying supplies up the ridge when the call came through. An off-grid family, no phone. A neighbor's dog had run off and wandered near the cabin. That was the only reason anyone found her. 9 years old, bruises hidden under 4 layers of flannel in the middle of June. She hadn't cried either. She just raised her hand, palm flat against her chest, then looked away, like she was afraid of hope. He had gotten her out. That time, but Guatemala was different. The mission was humanitarian. A collapsed school, missing children, and then silence. One girl, 10 years old. Local staff said she ran every time an American voice got near, wouldn't speak, wouldn't scream, but she had been trying to signal for days. A nurse saw it in a grainy CCTV loop after the fact. Same hand motion, same silence. They found her too late. Buried in a sugarcane ditch 2 kilometers west of the camp. Ford had buried that part of the world behind stacked files and long, tired nights. But the little girl in Montana, just now, her silence sounded like both of them. Not screaming, not pleading, just steady, deliberate fear shaped into form. She turned her head slightly. Their eyes met, not for long, a second, maybe less, but it landed hard. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't begging. She was checking, as if her mind had a checklist, exit points, faces, threats, hope, and he was just one more box to scan. Her stare didn't hold panic. It held criteria. She wanted to know if he'd understood. He didn't nod. Didn't blink, but he didn't look away. And something inside her seemed to settle, just slightly. Her eyes dropped again, shoulders tightening. She was still alone, still locked inside whatever quiet cage she lived in. But for one breath of a moment, she'd allowed the possibility that someone else had seen. Harrison's heartbeat didn't change. He was too old for adrenaline, but something deeper stirred. Not rage, not pity, something worse, memory. The kind that walks with you long after the war ends. The kind that doesn't care whether you're retired, whether the world has moved on, whether you're still strong enough to do something about it. He didn't need another file in a locked drawer. And as the crowd surged behind him, as laughter rose and candy wrappers fluttered, Harrison Ford stood still in the reflection of a soda machine, watching a girl who said nothing, but spoke louder than anyone else on the street. The parade swelled. Music thundered from brass horns as the high school band rounded the corner, blue uniforms flashing in the sun. Children shrieked with delight, chasing paper streamers that spun like falling petals. A candy wrapper floated through the air and landed at Lily's feet. She didn't move. Her arms stayed still, her gaze fixed straight ahead, locked onto nothing. Harrison Ford didn't look at her now, not directly. But he saw her in every reflection, every ripple of glass and chrome and shadow. And he wasn't the only one. A woman beside Lily shifted, Scottish accent light and warm, as she bent slightly toward the girl. "First time seeing the parade, sweetheart. My boys have been talking about it all week." Her tone was gentle, kind, the sort that came naturally to people who knew how to talk to children without expecting a response. Lily blinked. Not wide-eyed or startled, just a slow, unsure flicker of attention, like she was trying to decide if it was safe to hear someone else's voice. Before she could speak, the man beside her stepped in. His smile was quick, soft, rehearsed. "We're just enjoying a quiet moment, if you don't mind." His hand dropped to Lily's shoulder, guiding her half a step back. "Of course," the woman replied, still smiling, still polite, retreating with the practiced grace of someone who didn't want to cause a scene. But her smile didn't reach her eyes, and her husband, quiet and stooped in a beige cap, didn't smile at all. He watched the man's hand linger just a second too long. Ford saw them both. Saw the way the older woman raised her fingers to her chest, as if trying to press back something she couldn't name. Saw the man's jaw tighten just a little as he glanced in Ford's direction. He didn't say anything, just looked. And Ford knew that look. "I see it too, but I don't know what to do." 2 steps to the left, a young mother with twin toddlers lifted her phone. She wasn't filming the floats. She wasn't aiming at the color guard. Her lens drifted toward Lily, discreet, half hidden behind a stroller. Her thumb hovered above the screen, then pulled back, then hovered again. Across the street, a man in a college sweatshirt turned, caught a glimpse of Lily's sleeve shifting, frowned. Then looked away. No one said a word, not yet. Ford's fingers curled slowly in his pocket, leather groaning faintly beneath the weight. Not enough to be seen, just enough to ground him. He wasn't law enforcement. He wasn't family. He wasn't even from this town. He had no badge, no orders, no authority, just a past that wouldn't let him turn away. The band reached a crescendo. Cymbals clashed. Flags whipped through the air. A little boy shouted something about tanks. Harrison barely heard it. His eyes stayed on the fragments, how Lily's feet stayed planted, but not comfortably, how her shoulders never settled, how her hands never reached for the candy raining down around her. Everyone saw something. Just enough to wonder, just enough to doubt themselves. The old couple, the young mother, the man in the sweatshirt, they were watching, but they weren't sure. And in that uncertainty, they did nothing. Ford frowned. The kind of frown that came from deep inside, not annoyance, but weight. His jaw shifted slightly, not from anger, from memory, because he'd seen this before, not the abuse, the silence around it. The stillness of crowds waiting for someone else to speak first. He glanced at Lily again. She hadn't moved since the man redirected her. Her hands were at her sides, her mouth pressed into a thin line, her gaze forward. But her eyes, they were watching everything, calculating everyone, and still no one moved. The worst kind of danger, Ford thought, wasn't always the one hiding in shadows. Sometimes it stood in sunlight, wrapped in polite smiles and parade music. Sometimes it stood inches from a child, surrounded by people who chose not to be certain. He shifted his weight, not forward, not yet, just enough to breathe, just enough to feel that quiet question rising like heat off pavement. Do I have the right? And then, louder, if I don't, who does? He looked around. At the mother lowering her phone, at the couple exchanging glances but saying nothing, at the man who had already turned away. This wasn't just about a girl anymore. It was about a town that saw everything and stayed silent. The noise cracked open like a sky splitting. A convoy of old military trucks rolled into view, engines growling, American flags draped over rusted hoods. Veterans stood in the back, waving stiffly, some saluting with arms that trembled under the sun. Children screamed for candy. Brass music surged, cymbals clanged, drums beat like war coming down a street paved with memory and denial. Red, white, and blue confetti burst overhead, showering the crowd in celebration. It was loud enough to drown anything, except what wasn't being said. Harrison Ford didn't move, not yet. He stood near the edge of a planter box, one shoulder resting against brick, head lowered just enough to look unassuming. But his eyes never blinked, and the girl turned, not fully, not with a smile or a wave, just her head, slowly, like she was checking the horizon for signs of weather, like her world depended on whether anyone out there was watching. Her eyes found his again, and this time she didn't look away. He held the stare, still, flat, not pushing, not pulling, just present. Then her fingers twitched. It was small, barely visible through the fraying hem of her sleeve, but Ford saw it. The curl of her hand into a fist, the deliberate pause, then the slow, steady release, palm open, pressed to her chest. She didn't tremble, she didn't cry, she didn't even breathe like a frightened child. It was practiced, precise. like something she had memorized for a day when no other tools would work. She had waited, she had scanned, and now she was asking a question without words. A second signal, Ford's breath caught, not from surprise, but from certainty. A security marshal stationed along the metal barriers looked up. He saw Ford's profile and took a step forward. The man was young, maybe late 20s, clipboard tucked under one arm, walkie crackling at his hip. He didn't say anything, but the way his eyes narrowed made the message clear. Step back, don't get involved. This isn't yours. Ford didn't speak. He simply turned his head and looked directly at the guard. One long second, no smile. No frown, just the weight of a man who had spent 80 years learning which moments mattered. And the young man hesitated. Something in him flinched, not from fear, but from recognition. Then Ford gave a tiny shake of his head. Barely noticeable, but final. And then he stepped forward, one foot, then another, slow, measured, like the ground beneath him didn't move unless he said it could. No announcement, no shouting, no confrontation, just motion. He didn't walk like someone storming in to make a point. He walked like someone who had seen enough not to waste time asking permission. The crowd didn't notice, not yet. Their attention was still pulled toward marching veterans and floating balloons shaped like cartoon dogs. But Ford's world had shrunk, just him, the girl, and the space between them closing. Lily saw it. Her eyes widened, not in panic, not in confusion, but in something closer to belief. Like a door creaked open inside her, one she hadn't dared test before. He had seen, and he was moving. The man beside her hadn't noticed yet. His eyes were on his phone, checking something, maybe a photo, maybe a text. His hand still rested on her shoulder, fingers tapping a slow rhythm that had nothing to do with the music. Ford kept walking, 10 feet, 8, 6. The security guard stayed back. His hand hovered near his radio but never touched it. Whatever he'd seen in Ford's face had been enough. And Lily, she didn't move, but her shoulders shifted, not back, not away, but forward. Just enough to meet the moment. There was no applause, no camera flashes, just the low hum of decision filling the air like static. Harrison Ford had stepped into many places he wasn't invited. War zones, disaster sites. Boardrooms filled with suits who had no idea what it meant to carry silence. But this was different. Because this time, the girl had already spoken. And she hadn't used a single word. Ford kept his eyes on her. He didn't check the man. He didn't scan the crowd. His focus was a line drawn between two people who had seen things they weren't supposed to. One of them small, still, uncertain. The other, older, worn, but unflinching. He took one more step, then stopped. The distance was gone now, not physically, emotionally, spiritually, practically. And for the first time that day, Lily wasn't alone in her signal. She was answered, not with a voice, not with a rescue, but with a man who had decided, finally, that stillness wasn't enough. He stopped exactly 10 feet away, not a step more, not a step less, close enough to be heard, far enough not to be mistaken for threat. The man beside Lily noticed it late. At first, he turned with casual curiosity, a polite smile curling at the corners of his mouth, as if preparing to greet a neighbor or a lost tourist. His hand tightened briefly on the girl's shoulder, then relaxed. He studied Harrison Ford, squinting slightly against the sun, confused by the lack of motion, the absence of expression. Ford didn't speak, not yet. He looked at Lily first. Her eyes had dropped. Her shoulders had tensed again, as if afraid she'd made a mistake. But he didn't look away, and slowly she lifted her gaze, just an inch, just long enough to see he hadn't turned back. Then came the first words. I saw the signal. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't cut through the crowd or rise above the drums still pounding a block away. But it carried, it always had. The man blinked. Excuse me, the girl, Ford said quietly. She gave the signal. The one children are taught when they can't scream, the one that says something's wrong. There was a silence behind the noise, a hush in the narrow space around them that hadn't been there a moment ago. The man straightened, his smile stiffening. Sir, she was just waving. She's shy. She waves weird. Kids do that. You know how they are. Ford shook his head once. That wasn't a wave. The girl didn't move. She seemed caught between breaths. Frozen in the middle of a moment she had imagined 100 ways, none of them like this. The man's tone shifted. "Look, I don't know what you think you saw, but you're making a mistake. I'm her father." Ford's reply came slow, even. "I don't care who you say you are. I care that she hasn't smiled once since I've been standing here." The crowd hadn't fully caught on, but it was starting. A couple nearby turned their heads. A mother further down the barrier stopped mid-photo, her phone lowering just slightly. Someone whispered, "Is that?" The man's face tensed. He tried to laugh. "Okay, this is getting weird. She's just sensitive. She doesn't like loud crowds, that's all." Ford took one half step closer. His boots barely scuffed the pavement. His hands remained at his sides. His voice stayed low. "That doesn't explain the bruises." The man flinched. His eyes darted to Lily, then back. "Look, you can't just accuse people in the middle of a parade. You're going to scare her." A voice cut in from the left. "I've been filming." A woman stepped forward, holding her phone up, the red light still blinking. "Since before he got here." More heads turned. "I saw the way you grabbed her wrist," she added. "It wasn't protection. It was possession." The man's eyes narrowed. "You people don't know anything about our situation. She's just shy." Ford didn't raise his voice. But something in his presence shifted. Like pressure building behind a dam. "She's not shy, she's silent. And that silence isn't choice. It's survival." A uniformed officer was making his way through the crowd now, alerted not by shouting, but by the density of stillness forming around this moment. The man saw him too. "Let's all just calm down," he said quickly. He crouched slightly to Lily's level. "Honey, tell them everything's okay. We're just sightseeing." Lily didn't speak. Ford took another step forward. The man's shoulders twitched. He tried to laugh again, but it came out too thin. "You can't just walk up to people and—" Ford cut him off. "I didn't walk up to people. I walked up to her because she asked me to, not with words, but with a signal that means everything to people who actually know what danger looks like." More phones were out now, more eyes watching. The tide was turning, and the man felt it. He turned back to Lily, voice tighter. "Right, Lily, tell them. Say something." She opened her mouth, closed it again. Her eyes darted, not to Ford, not to the crowd, but to the space between her feet. Her hands had curled into fists again, shaking slightly. Ford didn't look at the man anymore. He looked at her. "You don't have to explain," he said it soft. "You already did. I'm just the one who heard you." The man stepped forward. "Enough. This is getting out of hand. She's just dramatic. She's always been that way." Ford didn't flinch, didn't raise a hand, but the air around him thickened. "You're not here to calm her. You're here to control her. There's a difference, and she knows it." The officer reached the outer edge of the circle, pausing to assess. His hand rested on his belt, ready but cautious. "Sir," he called toward Ford, "everything okay here?" Ford didn't answer. "Not yet." The man puffed up, turning. "This guy's harassing us. I want him gone. He's interfering. I don't know who he thinks he is." Ford finally turned to the officer. "He thinks he's the only one who didn't look away." The crowd went quiet. Not a performance, not a speech, just truth laid down like stone. And in that stillness something cracked, not in Ford, in the man, in the crowd. In the story, this little girl had been forced to live without a single word spoken. Because sometimes all it takes is one voice to break the silence everyone else agreed to keep. And today, it had finally spoken. The man's smile had vanished. His voice was louder now, sharper, cutting through the hum of the parade, as if to reclaim control by volume alone. "Enough of this," he snapped. "Come on, Lily, we are leaving." His hand reached down, fingers wrapping around her wrist fast, too fast, not like a father guiding, but like someone snapping a leash back onto something slipping free. She flinched, just slightly, her knees locked. She didn't resist, but she didn't move either. Ford didn't speak. He didn't shout or raise a hand. He stepped forward, one step, maybe two, and something in the air shifted. The man felt it, not in sound, in pressure. The kind of weight that doesn't come from muscle, but from stillness held too long. That kind of presence doesn't ask, it stops. "Let her go." The words didn't rise, they settled, low, solid, immovable. The man scoffed. "You can't stop me. She's my daughter." He tried to pull her again. Her feet dragged an inch, then caught. She looked down, her hands clenched tighter. Ford moved, not fast, not showy, just a single sidestep, then another, placing himself between them. He didn't shove, didn't touch. He didn't have to. The man's hand froze mid-motion. The space between them thickened. I said let her go, and then it happened. The man's hand dropped from Lily's wrist, but only so he could raise the other. A swing, clumsy but full of intent. A punch thrown by someone used to getting their way, not by force but by dominance. It never landed. Ford shifted his weight, half a step back. The fist grazed air. And in the same breath, he caught the man's wrist, turned it, brought it down and across. A clean joint lock, controlled, sharp, final. The man dropped to one knee with a shout, not from injury but from pain, the kind delivered with precision and just enough restraint to remind someone exactly how little control they really had. Gasps rippled from the crowd, phones shot up, children went quiet, candy fell from fingers and hit the pavement without notice. Ford released. The man collapsed forward, catching himself on his palms, face red, breath shallow, rage bubbling just beneath the surface. A voice cut through, "Sir, step back." A uniformed officer now inside the circle, hand near his belt, eyes scanning. Ford lifted both hands, took 2 steps back without resistance. "He assaulted me," the man spat, rising with a wobble. "That's assault. He grabbed me. I want him arrested. Do you even know who he is? That's Harrison Ford or whoever. He attacked me in front of witnesses." Another voice spoke, calm, female. "I've been recording since before he said a word." A young mother standing now with her phone still raised, red light blinking. "You grabbed her. You pulled her like she was yours. You twisted her arm. You threatened her." "She's my daughter," the man barked. "She called you her stepfather," an older man added, "and she never smiled, not once." Lily stood still, eyes wide, hands trembling, but she hadn't run, she hadn't cried, and she hadn't looked away. Another officer approached Lily carefully. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Lily didn't answer. The man shouted over the tension, "She's dramatic. She lies. She always does this when she doesn't get her way." Ford looked at him, not as a hero, not as a soldier. As a man who had finally seen enough. "You've been heard," he said, "and no one believes you anymore." Lily's voice followed, quiet, raw. "I'm not clumsy. That's what he always says. That I fall, that I trip, but I don't. I didn't say anything, but I did today." The female officer crouched. "Do you have any injuries right now?" Lily nodded. "May I see?" She rolled up her sleeves. The bruises weren't subtle, not anymore. They climbed her arms like shadows of hands that had no right to be there, some yellowed, some fresh, some shaped like fingers, some shaped like fists. The officer stood slowly. "Sir," she said to the man, "we need you to come with us." "You have no right," he yelled. "She's mine. You people have no idea." An officer took his arm, the other blocked his path. The cuffs clicked, a clean sound, official, final. "You'll regret this," he hissed toward Ford. Ford didn't blink. He didn't respond with anger, just a sentence, so soft the wind barely caught it. "Do you know what I regret? Every child I couldn't hear in time." The officer nodded toward him. "Understood, sir. Thank you." Lily looked up at Ford, not with awe, not with gratitude, just with the slow, shaking eyes of someone realizing, for the first time, that maybe silence didn't have to be the only language they were allowed. He didn't touch her, he didn't kneel, he just stood steady, still, present. Then, in the middle of Main Street, surrounded by sirens and phones and stilled breath, he asked the only question that mattered. Did anyone here see her smile today? The answer was silence, and in that silence, the truth rang louder than anything else. The room was quiet, too quiet for a place that had been full of flashing lights and raised voices just hours earlier. The overhead light hummed softly, casting a pale circle onto the tiled floor. A vending machine in the corner blinked through its options, untouched. The parade was long over. The streets outside had returned to silence. And inside the small exam room, Lily sat alone on the paper-covered bench, a thin hospital blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her feet swinging just above the floor. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She stared at the linoleum like it had betrayed her. The door creaked open, she didn't look up, but the footsteps that followed didn't rush. They were steady, familiar, worn, the kind of steps that didn't demand to be heard but couldn't be mistaken. Harrison Ford walked in without a word, a folder in hand. He handed it to the attending nurse behind the desk. She opened it, scanned the contents, and nodded once. Emergency foster authorization, she said, military guardian program. All cleared. She didn't ask if he was sure. She didn't need to. She stepped out and closed the door behind her. Ford didn't sit right away. He stood there for a moment, watching Lily without pressing. She didn't lift her head. He spoke gently, not to fill space, but because some truths only work when spoken soft. "You don't trust me, do you?" She didn't respond. He took a slow breath and sat down beside her, not too close, close enough. "That's okay," he said. "I wouldn't either." Still, she said nothing. He looked straight ahead. "I've left before, you know. Someone needed help and I got there too late. I still think about her, every year, every time I land that old plane. Every time I close my eyes." Lily's voice came small and flat. "I told before, they didn't believe me. They sent me home." Ford nodded. "I know." He waited, then added, "But this time you weren't alone. This time someone stayed." The silence between them stretched, not heavy, just honest. Finally her hand moved, not much, just a slow reach, fingers hesitant. She didn't grab his arm, she didn't hug, she touched his hand. Gently, testing. Ford didn't flinch. He let her, and after a second she wrapped her small fingers around his. Not tight, but not letting go. Outside the room, life had started moving again. Phones ringing, papers shuffling, but in here, time held still. She looked up at him for the first time since the street. Her eyes weren't filled with fear, not anymore, just questions, one more test. He looked back at her, steady, quiet. "I'm still here," he said. Her grip tightened a little. And for the first time, she breathed, really breathed. When he stood, she stood too. He didn't say where they were going. He didn't need to. He held the door open and she stepped through. She didn't ask if it was safe. Because for once, she didn't have to. She just didn't let go. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.